The small-town diner had stood for decades, unchanged. The faded red booths, a buzzing neon sign reading Clara's Home Diner, and the smell of strong coffee mixed with sizzling bacon greeted everyone who walked through the door. It was a typical Southern establishment where locals lingered over their meals and gossiped. Behind the counter, Sandy, the veteran waitress with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, had worked there for over 20 years. Her regulars loved her blunt nature. Outsiders, not so much. On a hot, late summer afternoon, the old bell above the door jingled. Sandy glanced up as a tall, elegant black woman walked in. Her name was Camille Bennett, mid-40s, dressed in a crisp white blouse and navy slacks. She exuded confidence. Her polished demeanor immediately made her stand out. Camille paused, scanning the diner with a faint smile. But when her gaze landed on Sandy, the warmth faded. Sandy frowned. "Afternoon. Can I help you?" she asked, her tone flat. Camille approached the counter and sat on a bar stool. "I'd like a coffee and the lunch special, please." Sandy didn't write anything down. Instead, she folded her arms and tilted her head. "Are you passing through?" Camille raised an eyebrow. "I suppose you could say that." "Well, honey," Sandy replied, her voice dripping with thinly veiled hostility, "we don't usually serve folks we don't know. You understand?" Camille blinked, taken aback. "I'm sorry?" "I said we don't serve strangers," Sandy repeated curtly. "Small town. We like to keep to our own." Camille stared at her for a moment, disbelief flashing across her face. She glanced around the diner. A few patrons were watching now. Some avoided her gaze, pretending to focus on their plates. Others exchanged looks, clearly understanding the exchange. This wasn't about strangers. It was about her. Taking a deep breath, Camille stood. "I don't want any trouble. I just wanted a meal." "Well, then you can try somewhere down the road." Sandy turned away dismissively, pouring coffee for an older couple at the other end of the counter. The diner was silent, except for the faint clinking of cutlery. Camille swallowed hard. Years of navigating these moments had taught her to keep her composure, but the sting never got easier. "It's 2024, she thought bitterly, and this is still happening. She turned, her heels clicking against the worn tiles, and exited the diner without another word. The bell above the door rang once more, but this time it sounded hollow. Waitress at the drain ran outside. The heat hit Camille like a wall. She leaned against her car, trying to calm herself. Her hands trembled with frustration. She hadn't come looking for conflict. She was here for a reason, a personal one. Her son, Jonathan Bennett, had recently shared big news with her, the news that he'd invested in a local diner. And not just any diner, this diner. Jonathan had always been ambitious. After earning his MBA and working with high-end investors, he'd decided to step back from corporate life to focus on businesses with community impact. A diner in a quiet town seemed odd, but Jonathan had a plan. When he told Camille he'd bought it, he asked her to visit the place in secret, see how the staff treated people. Now she had her answer. Jonathan's going to hear about this, she thought, sliding into the car. Anger simmered just beneath her calm exterior. She would never understand how people like Sandy could behave that way so casually, so confidently, like cruelty was second nature. Meanwhile, the diner inside, Sandy watched Camille leave through the window, muttering under her breath. A few customers murmured uncomfortably. "Was that really necessary, Sandy?" one older man asked. Sandy shrugged. "We've got our way of doing things here, Henry. Folks like her don't belong." Later that evening that night, Jonathan Bennett arrived in town. Camille had called him, her voice calm but firm. "You need to see this for yourself, John," she'd said. Jonathan didn't argue. The next morning, he stood in the very diner his mother had described. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a sharp gray suit, Jonathan didn't look like he belonged there either. But unlike his mother, Jonathan wasn't here for a meal. He was here for the truth. Sandy spotted him immediately. She marched over, pasting on a fake smile. "Can I help you, sir?" Jonathan leaned against the counter. "You're Sandy, right?" "That's me. Are you looking for someone?" "I'm Jonathan Bennett," he replied smoothly, "the owner of this diner." The blood drained from Sandy's face. Jonathan held her gaze. "We need to talk." The silence in the diner was deafening. Sandy froze, her expression a mix of shock and disbelief. The word owner echoed in her mind like a thunderclap. The man in front of her, young, polished, and confident, didn't look like anyone who'd be running this old diner. He didn't fit the picture in her head. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice faltering. Jonathan's expression remained calm, but his dark eyes held a sharp edge. "You heard me," he said. "I'm Jonathan Bennett. I bought this diner 3 months ago." Sandy's mouth opened, then closed. She fumbled for words, but couldn't find any. The other patrons had fallen silent, their forks suspended mid-air, eyes darting between Sandy and Jonathan like spectators at a boxing match. Jonathan continued, his voice low but firm. "I've heard some things about how you run this place, Sandy. And after what happened yesterday with my mother, I decided to see for myself." Sandy's face turned pale. Your mother?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Yes, the woman you refused to serve because, let's not pretend otherwise, she didn't look like someone you thought belonged here." Sandy's hands clenched the dish towel she'd been holding, her knuckles white. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. "I told her we don't serve strangers." "Enough," Jonathan cut her off, his voice rising just enough to make her flinch. "You and I both know that wasn't the truth." The diner was so still that even the faint hum of the ceiling fan felt loud. There's Sandy flashback. 3 months ago. When Jonathan first bought Clara's diner, he had a vision. The place was run down, but had potential. It reminded him of the neighborhood cafes his grandmother used to take him to as a child. Places where people came together, where memories were made over plates of biscuits and gravy. Jonathan saw more than just a business opportunity. He saw a chance to build something that mattered. At first, Jonathan left the staff alone, observing from afar. Sandy had been the head waitress for years, and according to the old manager, she was tough but reliable. Jonathan trusted that, but his mother, Camille, always warned him, "Character isn't always visible on the surface. Watch how people treat others when they think no one's watching." Yesterday proved she was right. Back in the present, Sandy finally found her voice. "Look, I've worked here for over 20 years, she said defensively. "I know what I'm doing. I know these customers. I don't need some outsider coming in and telling me how to do my job." Jonathan tilted his head slightly, his patience wearing thin. "So, refusing to serve a paying customer, my mother, is part of the job?" "It's not like that," Sandy shot back, her voice rising with panic. "I didn't know who she was." "That's exactly the problem, isn't it?" Jonathan interrupted coldly. "You didn't know who she was, so you thought it was okay to treat her like she didn't matter." Sandy's eyes darted around the diner, looking for support, but no one spoke. The regulars who usually backed her were avoiding her gaze, shrinking in their seats. It was clear to everyone that Jonathan had called her out, and there was no excuse for what she'd done. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice low but powerful. "This diner is supposed to be a place where everyone feels welcome. It doesn't matter what they look like, where they come from, or whether you know them. If you can't treat people with basic respect, then you don't belong here." Sandy's face flushed red. "Are you firing me?" Jonathan didn't blink. "What do you think?" Later. That afternoon, the news spread quickly through town. Sandy had been let go. Some whispered that it was long overdue. Others, particularly her friends, grumbled about outsiders coming in and changing things. But many people who'd been quietly uncomfortable with Sandy's behavior for years, felt something they hadn't expected: relief. Camille returned to the diner later that day. Jonathan was waiting for her at a booth, 2 cups of coffee on the table. "I didn't think you'd come back here," he said, as she sat across from him. Camille smiled faintly. "I didn't think I would either." Jonathan slid a cup toward her. "How did I do?" Camille raised an eyebrow. "You handled it well. Firm, but fair." Jonathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't want it to go that way, but I couldn't let her get away with it." "You did the right thing," Camille said softly. "People like her think they can act that way because no one will hold them accountable." "You did." Jonathan studied his mother for a moment. "You okay?" She nodded, though her expression grew thoughtful. "I've dealt with people like Sandy my whole life. I'm used to it. But that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt." Jonathan reached across the table and took her hand. "Not here. Not anymore." Camille looked out the window at the small town street, sunlight streaming through the glass. "You're going to make this place better, John. I can feel it." The next day, the diner reopened with Jonathan personally greeting customers at the door. He made it clear to everyone. This was a fresh start. The sign outside now read, "Clara's Diner, a place for everyone." Some people grumbled, others smiled, but no one missed Sandy. As the days passed, something remarkable happened. New faces began appearing at the diner, people who'd stayed away before because they didn't feel welcome. A young black couple came in for breakfast, their toddler giggling as Jonathan brought him a free cookie. An older Hispanic man thanked Jonathan for the coffee, saying quietly, "I haven't been here in years." Jonathan's heart swelled with pride. This was what he'd dreamed of. Audi das Außen. Meanwhile, Sandy sat at her kitchen table, staring into her cold coffee. She'd told herself that she didn't care, that Jonathan had been unfair, that she'd been disrespected. But deep down, something gnawed at her. Maybe Jonathan had been right. She thought about Camille, about the way she'd looked, dignified and hurt, but never angry. Sandy remembered the silence in the diner as Camille walked out, and for the first time, shame crept into her chest. She'd been wrong, and now she had to live with it. Jonathan's diner was no longer the same. With Sandy gone, the tense atmosphere she had once cast over the place began to lift. Little by little, the customers noticed. The air felt lighter, the coffee tasted warmer, and the sense of exclusion that had lingered in Clara's diner for years was starting to disappear. But transformation didn't happen overnight. Jonathan knew that if he wanted to keep his vision alive, he'd need to hire the right people, staff who reflected the values he believed in. The first morning, without Sandy, Jonathan stood behind the counter in Sandy's old spot, tying a borrowed apron around his waist. His mother, Camille, sat at a booth nearby, quietly watching her son take orders and pour coffee. "Morning, Mr. Bennett," an elderly regular named Henry said as he slid into a booth. Henry had been eating at the diner for decades, but he still looked unsure of the changes. "Don't suppose you make eggs like Sandy, do you?" Jonathan smiled warmly. "I don't know about like Sandy, but I'll do my best." Henry grumbled something under his breath, but cracked a small smile. Camille watched, her eyes twinkling with pride. "What?" Jonathan asked, noticing her amused expression as he wiped his hands on his apron. "You in an apron. Now I've seen it all," Camille teased. "I'm short-staffed. You're lucky I'm not flipping pancakes." Jonathan had posted a "Hiring Now" sign on the window that morning. He wasn't just looking for replacements. He was looking for change. He wanted people who would treat every customer like family. As the day went on, Jonathan greeted customers personally, making sure each one felt seen and welcomed. Some were hesitant, still loyal to Sandy in their own quiet way, but others noticed something refreshing about Jonathan's approach, something different. Thank you for being here, Jonathan said to a young family as they left. We hope to see you again soon. The father, holding his toddler's hand, smiled back. We stopped coming years ago. It's good to see someone like you running this place. Jonathan felt a flicker of warmth in his chest. Sandy's reflection. Meanwhile, Sandy sat alone in her small, cluttered kitchen. She hadn't left the house since she'd been fired. She told herself she didn't care, that Jonathan and his mother didn't belong in her diner anyway. But every time she tried to justify herself, her mind returned to that woman, Camille. Camille's composed, dignified face haunted Sandy. You didn't know who she was, so you thought it was okay to treat her like she didn't matter. Jonathan's words had struck deeper than she'd realized. At first, Sandy had been angry, railing against the unfairness of it all. But now, sitting alone with nothing but her thoughts, she couldn't deny the truth. I was wrong. The words were bitter and heavy in her mouth, but they were true. She stared at the old clock ticking on the wall. For 20 years, she'd served coffee and pancakes in that diner, and for 20 years, she'd made up her mind about people the moment they walked through the door. Sandy had always seen herself as the gatekeeper of Clara's diner. But now, for the first time, she wondered if she'd been shutting out more than she let in. Wabisa new faces. The next morning, Jonathan interviewed potential new hires. One of them was a woman named Maria Reyes, a single mother in her early 30s with a warm smile and a history of working in hospitality. She spoke about her experience working in cafes and diners, but what caught Jonathan's attention was her passion. I've worked places where people didn't feel welcome, Maria said softly. I want to work somewhere that feels different. Jonathan smiled, offering her his hand. Welcome to the team, Maria. That same day, he hired another server, a college student named Marcus, who was eager for work to help pay for his tuition. By the end of the week, Clara's diner had a new staff, people who shared Jonathan's vision and believed in his goal, to make the diner a place where everyone belonged. Camille returns. Camille returned to the diner a few days later, just in time for the lunch rush. She took her usual seat near the window, watching the flow of new energy in the place. Maria carried plates to a table of regulars, chatting cheerfully, while Marcus joked with two teenagers sitting at the counter. Jonathan walked over, carrying a fresh cup of coffee for his mother. Well? He asked. Camille sipped the coffee and gave him an approving nod. It feels different. Better. Jonathan exhaled a quiet sigh of relief. We've got a long way to go, but it's a start. It's more than a start, John, Camille replied. You're creating something real here. Before Jonathan could respond, the bell above the door jingled. He turned to see a familiar face. Sandy. She stood in the doorway, looking smaller than she ever had before. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by uncertainty. The diner grew quieter as people noticed her. Jonathan's expression remained neutral as she approached the counter. What can I get you? Jonathan asked, his tone polite but distant. Sandy hesitated, wringing her hands together. I'm not here for food, she said finally. Her voice was softer than anyone had ever heard it. I came to apologize. The room seemed to hold its breath. Sandy looked around, avoiding people's eyes. Finally, she looked at Jonathan. I was wrong, she said, her voice trembling. About your mother, about how I treated her. She paused, her shoulders slumping. I guess I've been wrong about a lot of things. Jonathan didn't say anything for a moment. He studied her carefully, weighing her words. Thank you for saying that, he said finally. Sandy swallowed hard. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I just wanted you to know. I'm sorry. Jonathan nodded, his expression softening slightly. Apology accepted. Sandy blinked, as if surprised. That's more than I deserve. Jonathan glanced around the diner. Everyone deserves a chance to change, Sandy. It's what you do next that matters. Sandy nodded slowly. Without another word, she turned and walked out the door. Camille, who had watched the entire exchange, spoke softly. You handled that well. Jonathan shrugged. People can change. Maybe she will. Camille smiled faintly. You've got a good heart, John. Jonathan looked around the diner, at Maria laughing with a customer, at Marcus pouring coffee for an elderly woman, at the new faces who now felt at home here. We're just getting started, he said. At the small-town diner, now buzzing with life and fresh energy, felt like a new place entirely. The transformation hadn't gone unnoticed. News of Jonathan Bennett, an ambitious young black man who'd revitalized Clara's diner, had spread beyond the town limits. For some, the change was a breath of fresh air. For others, it stirred unease, especially among those who weren't ready to accept a shift in their routines or attitudes. But Jonathan wasn't backing down. A quiet morning. It was early morning when Jonathan arrived at the diner, the sun just peeking over the hills. Maria and Marcus were already inside, prepping for the breakfast rush. Camille had taken to stopping by regularly to lend quiet support, her presence a source of strength for her son. Jonathan flipped the sign on the door to open and took a moment to look around. The diner gleamed with fresh paint and polished countertops. It was clean, bright, and welcoming, exactly as he'd envisioned. "Morning, boss," Marcus called out with a grin, balancing a stack of plates. "Morning, Marcus," Jonathan replied, his lips curving into a small smile. "Another busy day ahead," Maria chimed in from the kitchen window. "I heard there's a group of teachers coming in for breakfast." "Good," Jonathan said. "Let's make sure they feel at home." The teacher's arrival. An hour later, the diner was buzzing. A group of 6 teachers, diverse in age and background, sat in one of the larger booths, laughing and chatting. Maria served them with her usual warmth, keeping their coffee cups filled and plates coming. "This place feels so different now," one of the women said, looking around. "I haven't been here in years." Her colleague nodded. "It's nice to see someone putting care into this place." Jonathan overheard their conversation as he passed by, and a sense of pride swelled in his chest. This is what it's all about, he thought, but not everyone felt that way. The old guard. At the counter, Henry, the elderly regular, sat nursing his coffee, his usual spot giving him a front-row view of the changes. Next to him was Frank, a gruff mechanic who'd been friends with Sandy for years. Frank had been one of the loudest voices complaining about Jonathan's leadership since Sandy's firing. "This ain't the same place," Frank muttered, shaking his head. "It don't feel right." Henry glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. "What doesn't feel right, Frank? The clean tables? The smiling staff? Or the fact that someone new is running things?" Frank grumbled under his breath. "It's not about that." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Then what is it about?" Frank didn't answer. Instead, he finished his coffee and tossed a few crumpled bills on the counter. "I'm heading out." Jonathan, who had been watching quietly from the far end of the diner, knew that men like Frank were the real challenge. He'd seen it before, resistance to change, fear of the unknown. It wasn't always about race or prejudice. Sometimes it was just about pride. An unexpected encounter. Later that afternoon, as the lunch crowd thinned out, the bell above the door jingled, and to Jonathan's surprise, Sandy walked in. The diner fell silent, all eyes turning toward her. Jonathan, who had been pouring coffee at a nearby table, straightened and met her gaze. "Afternoon," Sandy said awkwardly, her voice quieter than usual. "Afternoon," Jonathan replied, his tone calm but wary. Sandy hesitated before approaching the counter. She looked around, taking in the changes, the brighter atmosphere, the new staff, the customers who seemed genuinely happy. It was as if she didn't recognize the place she'd worked in for 2 decades. I wanted to talk to you, Sandy said, stopping a few feet from Jonathan. He nodded slowly. I'm listening. Sandy shifted on her feet, her fingers tugging at the hem of her worn jacket. I've been thinking about what you said, about how I treated people. She swallowed hard, her voice shaking. I was wrong. I thought I was protecting the place, keeping things the way they'd always been. But I see now that I was just holding it back. Jonathan's expression remained neutral, but inside, he felt a flicker of surprise. He hadn't expected Sandy to return, let alone admit her mistakes. I wanted to tell you again. I'm sorry, and if you'd have me back, even just to help out, I'd like to make it right. The diner was so quiet that even the faint hum of the coffee machine sounded loud. Jonathan studied Sandy carefully. He could see the discomfort on her face, the struggle in her eyes. Apologizing wasn't easy for someone like her. Finally, he spoke. Sandy, it's not about me. It's about the people who come here, the ones you turned away because you thought they didn't belong. Sandy's shoulders sagged. I know, and I want to do better. Jonathan paused, his mind turning. He believed in second chances. His mother had taught him that. But he also knew that trust wasn't given. It had to be earned. I can't put you back behind the counter right away, Jonathan said finally. But if you're serious about making things right, I'll give you a chance. You can help out. Clean tables, restock supplies. Show me you've changed. Sandy nodded quickly, relief washing over her face. I'll do whatever it takes. Jonathan extended a hand. Then let's start there. Sandy stared at his hand for a moment before shaking it. Her grip was firm, but her face betrayed her emotion. For the first time in years, she felt hope. Camille's wisdom. That evening, as Jonathan wiped down the counter, Camille sat at her usual booth, watching him. You're giving her a chance, she said softly. Jonathan nodded. People can change, but they have to want to. Camille smiled faintly. You're a better man than most, John. Jonathan shrugged, his gaze thoughtful. You taught me that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means giving people a chance to do better. And what if they don't? Camille asked. Then at least I'll know I tried, Jonathan replied. Camille sipped her coffee, pride filling her chest. Her son wasn't just rebuilding a diner. He was rebuilding a community. And in a place where division had once festered, Jonathan was planting seeds of unity, seeds that would take time to grow, but would eventually bear fruit. And the town talk's word spread quickly that Sandy was back at the diner, but not in the role she'd once held. Some were surprised Jonathan had let her return at all. Others saw it as a sign of his character. What do you think about her coming back? Henry asked Frank at the mechanic's shop. Frank grunted, wiping grease from his hands. I think maybe the kid's got a point. Maybe we all need to do better. Henry smiled knowingly. Took you long enough to figure that out. Frank didn't argue. For the first time, he didn't have anything to say. The sun rose quietly over the small town, its golden rays spilling through the large front windows of Clara's diner. Inside, the staff bustled, preparing for another busy day. The fresh scent of bacon sizzling on the grill and coffee brewing filled the air. Jonathan stood near the window, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. To anyone else, it might seem like just another morning, but to Jonathan, it felt like a small victory. Sandy stood quietly near the back of the diner, wiping down tables. She was no longer the confident, commanding presence she had once been. Her movements were slower, more deliberate, and she avoided eye contact with customers who remembered her as the waitress who ruled the diner like a gatekeeper. Jonathan kept an eye on her. He had taken a chance on Sandy, but he wasn't blind to the skepticism still lingering in the air. Giving her this opportunity wasn't popular with everyone, but he stood by his decision. Morning, John. The cheerful voice of Maria pulled him out of his thoughts. She approached with her notepad tucked into her apron and a warm smile on her face. Morning, Maria. Everything running smoothly? Jonathan asked. As smooth as butter, she replied with a grin. Marcus is handling the counter, and Sandy's keeping up with the tables. She glanced toward Sandy before adding, She's trying. I'll give her that. Jonathan nodded. That's all I ask. Change takes time. Maria's smile faded slightly. And what about the customers? Some of them are still uneasy. I know, Jonathan admitted, but people can surprise you. Sometimes you just have to show them what's possible. Sandy's quiet struggle. Sandy spent most of the morning clearing tables and refilling napkin holders. The job was humbling, menial work she'd never done before in her 20 years at the diner. She overheard the whispers from some of the customers. Can't believe she's back here after everything. Look at her now, serving instead of barking orders. Every comment stung, but Sandy bit her tongue and kept her head down. This was part of earning back trust, she reminded herself. As she cleared the table near the counter, Henry, the elderly regular, watched her carefully. He had always been a quiet observer, but today something pushed him to speak. Sandy? She flinched slightly but turned to face him. Yes? Henry looked at her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. It takes guts to come back after what happened. Not everyone would. Sandy swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. I just want to make things right. Henry nodded slowly. Then keep at it. People'll see. For the first time that day, Sandy felt a small flicker of hope. A test of patience. The lunch rush hit harder than usual. The diner was packed, and Maria and Marcus were moving quickly to keep up with the orders. Sandy worked silently, darting between tables to clear plates and wipe surfaces. Jonathan stayed behind the counter, watching everything. He had learned in the last few months that running a diner was about more than serving food. It was about creating an experience. Every smile, every greeting, every meal mattered. Then it happened. A man in his 50s, Frank, the mechanic, walked in and sat at the counter. Jonathan recognized him immediately. Frank had been one of Sandy's biggest supporters, vocal about his dislike for the changes Jonathan had made. Maria approached to take his order, but Frank's eyes flicked past her to Sandy, who was refilling the sugar jars. I want her to take my order, he said loudly, pointing at Sandy. The diner fell quiet. Jonathan straightened, his expression darkening. He saw Sandy freeze mid-motion, her hands trembling slightly. Maria looked at Jonathan, unsure of what to do. Frank, Jonathan said calmly, stepping out from behind the counter. Sandy isn't serving tables right now. Maria will help you. Frank turned to face Jonathan, his voice laced with challenge. What's the matter? She worked here for 20 years. Let her take my order. Jonathan held his gaze. If you're here to eat, Maria will serve you. If you're here to cause trouble, you can leave. The tension in the diner was palpable. Everyone waited for Frank's response. Frank scowled, his face red with frustration. He glanced at Sandy, who refused to meet his eyes, and then back at Jonathan. Fine, I'll take the eggs and bacon. Thank you, Maria said, scribbling the order before hurrying back to the kitchen. Jonathan watched Frank for a moment longer before returning behind the counter. The silence gradually faded as the diner returned to its usual hum of chatter and clinking cutlery. Sandy exhaled shakily, still standing near the sugar jars. Jonathan walked over to her and spoke quietly. You okay? She nodded stiffly. I didn't expect that. Jonathan's voice was gentle but firm. People like Frank are testing you. Don't let them win. Just keep showing up. Sandy looked at him then, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and shame. Thank you. Small steps forward. By the end of the day, Sandy felt exhausted, physically and emotionally. As the last customers left, she quietly wiped down the tables while Jonathan tallied the day's earnings. Maria approached Sandy, holding out a mug of tea. Here, you look like you need it. Sandy hesitated before taking it. Thank you. Maria sat across from her, studying her for a moment. You know, I didn't think I'd like you at first. Sandy blinked, startled. I can't blame you, Maria shrugged. Maybe not, but I've seen you these past few days. You're trying, and that counts for something. Sandy stared into the steaming mug, her voice soft. I've got a lot to make up for. Then keep going, Maria said simply. People will see. A quiet evening with Camille. That evening, as Jonathan locked up the diner, Camille waited outside for him. They walked together to his car, the night air cool and crisp. You're giving her a chance, Camille said after a moment. She's earning it, Jonathan replied, but I'm not letting her off easy. You shouldn't, Camille agreed. Change isn't just about saying sorry, it's about proving it, every day. Jonathan looked at his mother, her wisdom always guiding him. Do you think people can really change? Camille smiled faintly. I think people can change, but it takes courage and forgiveness. Jonathan nodded, staring up at the stars for a moment. We'll see how it goes. Camille touched his arm gently. You're doing good here, John. I hope you know that. Jonathan smiled, the weight of the day easing slightly. Thanks, Mom. We're just getting started. As they stood outside the diner, its windows dark and quiet for the night, Jonathan knew the journey wasn't over. There were still battles to fight, trust to earn, and wounds to heal. But for the first time, the town seemed ready for change. And so was he. The town of Maple Ridge was small, but it had a long memory. Change, as Jonathan had learned, didn't come swiftly or without resistance. Clara's diner was becoming a symbol of something bigger, progress, unity, and second chances. But not everyone welcomed it. The whispers lingered, and people still watched Sandy with wary eyes. It wasn't outright hostility anymore, but the quiet judgment hung in the air like a storm cloud, especially from those who'd once seen her as a pillar of the diner. But something was shifting. Sandy knew it, and she was determined to prove, if not to everyone else, then to herself, that she could be better. The hardest work, Sandy's new role was humbling. She arrived early to clean floors, refill supplies, and wipe down booths before the sun rose. Jonathan kept her off the main floor during peak hours, easing her back into the diner life without putting her in a position to falter. One afternoon, as Sandy restocked the pantry shelves, Maria walked in, looking exhausted but cheerful as always. Hey, Sandy, Maria said, sitting on an empty crate. You're working harder back here than I've ever seen anyone. Sandy turned, holding a box of sugar packets. I've got a lot to prove. Maria studied her for a moment, then smiled faintly. You're proving it. People notice. Sandy shook her head, laughing bitterly. No, they don't. They see the woman who turned away that nice lady. They see the woman Jonathan had to fire. Maria leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. That might be true now, but it doesn't have to be true forever. You know what my grandmother used to say? Sandy glanced at her. What? The only way to fix a broken bridge is one plank at a time. Sandy sighed, her shoulders sagging. How many planks do I have to lay? As many as it takes, Maria replied softly, one at a time. An unexpected gesture. The following week, Jonathan called Sandy into his small office at the back of the diner. It was the first time since her return that they'd spoken privately. Sit, Jonathan said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Sandy sat, wringing her hands nervously. Jonathan leaned back, his expression thoughtful as he watched her. I've been watching you, Jonathan said finally. You're working hard, harder than I expected. I'm trying, Sandy said quickly. I know I messed up. Jonathan held up a hand, silencing her. I know you are. He paused. I want to give you more responsibility. Sandy's eyes widened in surprise. What do you mean? Jonathan slid a notebook across the desk toward her. We're hosting a community breakfast this Saturday. Free meals for anyone who comes in. It's something I've been planning for a while to bring people together. I want you to help Maria organize it. Sandy froze, staring at the notebook like it might bite her. You want me to help? Yes, Jonathan said firmly. But hear me, Sandy. This is your chance. If you really want to show this town you've changed, this is how you do it. You show up, you work hard, and you make sure everyone feels welcome. No exceptions. Sandy nodded slowly, her throat tight. I won't let you down. Jonathan met her gaze. You better not. The community breakfast Saturday morning arrived bright and clear. The free community breakfast sign outside the diner drew people from all over town. The smell of pancakes, bacon, and freshly brewed coffee drifted out onto the street, mingling with the excited hum of conversation. Jonathan stood at the entrance, greeting everyone with a warm smile. Camille was nearby, helping Marcus carry trays of food to tables. Inside the kitchen, Sandy worked shoulder to shoulder with Maria. She plated pancakes, refilled syrup bottles, and even delivered food to tables when things got hectic. At one point, a young black family sat down near the window. The mothers smiled kindly as Sandy brought over their plates. Here you go, Sandy said, her voice a little shaky. Enjoy your meal. Thank you, the mother replied warmly. Sandy hesitated. You're welcome. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental to Sandy. She turned back toward the kitchen, her heart pounding. From across the diner, Jonathan saw the exchange. He didn't say anything, but he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Voh, a familiar face. As the breakfast began to wind down, Sandy noticed Henry sitting at the counter, eating a plate of eggs and toast. She grabbed a coffee pot and approached him, her hand trembling slightly. Need a refill? She asked. Henry looked up at her, his weathered face unreadable. Finally, he nodded. Sure. She poured the coffee carefully, then stood awkwardly, not sure what else to say. Good work today, Henry said unexpectedly, breaking the silence. Sandy blinked. What? Henry smirked faintly. You heard me. You're doing good. Sandy's throat tightened. Thank you. Henry shrugged. Don't thank me. Just keep doing it. Sandy turned back toward the kitchen, blinking quickly to stop the tears from coming. For the first time in weeks, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she was starting to rebuild that bridge Maria had talked about. The Jonathan's Reflection. As the community breakfast came to an end, Jonathan sat in one of the booths, watching as people lingered, talking and laughing. He saw old neighbors reconnecting, new faces blending in with regulars, and a sense of warmth that had been missing for years. His mother slid into the seat across from him, a tired but proud smile on her face. You did it, Camille said softly. Not just me, Jonathan replied, glancing toward the kitchen where Maria and Sandy were cleaning up. We all did. Camille followed his gaze, her expression thoughtful. She's trying, John. I know, Jonathan said. She's earned another step forward, but we'll see how far she's willing to go. Camille reached out and squeezed his hand. You're making a difference, son. Not just here, but for people like her. Giving her this chance, it means more than you know. Jonathan exhaled deeply, the weight of everything he'd worked for settling on his shoulders. It's not easy, Mom. No, Camille agreed, but the best things never are. Jonathan looked out the window, where sunlight streamed onto the sign that now read, Clara's Diner, a place for everyone. It was just a diner, but in a way, it was so much more. A cool wind swept through Maple Ridge on Monday morning, a signal that autumn was fast approaching. The leaves on the trees that lined the street were tinged with gold and amber, and the diner's large window framed the scene like a painting. Inside Clara's diner, the energy was different, alive, hopeful, but still fragile. It was a house rebuilt, yet cracks in its foundations still needed repair. Jonathan knew it would take more than a few weeks of good food and kind smiles to truly change the hearts of the town. And not everyone was convinced. A tense morning. The diner had barely opened when Frank walked in. His boots thudded heavily against the tile floor as he made his way to the counter. He took his usual stool, but there was no smugness in his demeanor today, only a heavy silence that made Maria and Marcus exchange a look of unease. Sandy was wiping down a table near the front when she noticed him. She froze for a moment before quickly averting her eyes and focusing on the task at hand. Jonathan saw it all, but said nothing, watching closely. Maria, ever the professional, approached Frank with her notepad. "Morning, Frank. What can I get you?" Frank's gaze flicked to Sandy before returning to Maria. "Coffee? Eggs over easy, and I'll take a side of bacon." Maria jotted the order down, but the tension didn't lift. Jonathan moved to the counter, stopping beside Frank as he poured himself a cup of coffee. "Morning," Jonathan said calmly. Frank grunted in reply, his hands wrapped around the steaming mug Maria set in front of him. After a long silence, he finally spoke, his voice low but clear. "I hear you're letting her stay." Jonathan didn't look up as he took a sip. "She's earning her place here, like everyone else." Frank scoffed. "She turned away good people for years, and now we're supposed to just forget about it?" Jonathan set his cup down carefully and met Frank's eyes. "No one's asking you to forget. I'm asking you to see what she's doing now. Everyone's got a choice, Frank. She's making hers." Frank stared at Jonathan for a moment, the two men locked in an unspoken challenge. Finally, Frank looked away, muttering under his breath as he dug into his eggs when they arrived. Sandy, watching quietly from across the room, couldn't hear their words, but she could feel the weight of the moment. Jonathan was defending her. Again. It was a kindness she felt she didn't deserve, but it was also a chance she refused to waste. Extending a hand. That afternoon, the lunch crowd slowed, and the diner grew quieter. Sandy, Maria, and Marcus worked to clean tables and prepare for the evening shift. Jonathan sat at his small corner booth, reviewing the week's receipts. As Sandy wiped down the counter, Maria leaned over and whispered, "I heard what Jonathan said to Frank this morning." Sandy glanced at her, uneasy. "What about it?" "He stood up for you," Maria said with a smile. "That's not something a lot of people would do." Sandy sighed, her shoulders drooping. "I don't know why he keeps giving me chances," Maria shrugged. "Maybe because he sees something in you." Sandy's brow furrowed. "I'm just trying to do my job." Maria tilted her head thoughtfully. "No, you're trying to do better. That's the difference." Sandy looked away, her throat tight. The truth of Maria's words struck her deeply. A community meeting. That evening, Jonathan sat in his office, reviewing paperwork, when Marcus knocked on the door. "Hey, boss," Marcus said, poking his head inside. "Henry and some of the folks are organizing a town meeting about the diner. Thought you should know." Jonathan's brow furrowed. "A town meeting?" Marcus nodded. "Yeah, some people are talking about how things are changing around here. I guess not everyone likes it." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "Let me guess. Frank's behind this?" Marcus shrugged. "Probably." Jonathan rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the day settle on his shoulders. The diner had come a long way, but clearly there were still people who weren't ready to accept what it was becoming. "Where's the meeting?" Jonathan asked. "The town hall. Tomorrow night." Jonathan nodded. "Thanks, Marcus." As Marcus left, Jonathan sat quietly for a moment, his thoughts racing. He'd known from the beginning that change wouldn't come easy, but he also knew he couldn't give up now. The town divided. The next evening, the town hall was filled with people, locals who'd known each other for years, some sitting quietly while others grumbled under their breath. Frank sat near the front, arms crossed over his chest, while Henry, ever the mediator, stood off to the side. Jonathan walked in with Camille by his side. Heads turned as the room fell silent. He scanned the crowd, seeing familiar faces, some friendly, others guarded. He took a deep breath before stepping to the front. Frank wasted no time. "What's happening to the diner, Jonathan?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "You come in, fire Sandy, change everything, and expect us to just go along with it?" Jonathan's calm voice cut through the tension. "I didn't fire Sandy to punish her. I fired her because the way she treated people wasn't right. And now, she's working to make it right." Frank scoffed. "People like her don't change." Camille, standing at the edge of the room, spoke up for the first time. "That's where you're wrong, Frank. People can change, but it takes time. It takes humility, and it takes a community willing to give them a chance." The room murmured as Frank shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. Jonathan looked out at the crowd, his voice steady. "This diner isn't just a business to me," he said. "It's a place for everyone, no matter who they are, where they come from, or what they look like. That's the promise I made when I took over, and it's the promise I'm going to keep." Henry, who had been silent until now, stood up. "I've been eating at Clara's diner for longer than most of you have been alive," he said, his voice strong. "And I'll tell you this, what Jonathan's doing isn't just good for the diner, it's good for all of us. It's time we stopped clinging to the past and started building a better future." The room fell quiet as Henry sat back down. Frank said nothing, his face tight with anger, but he didn't argue. Jonathan let out a slow breath and stepped back. "The diner is open to anyone who wants to be part of it. That's all I have to say." With that, he turned and walked out, Camille following close behind. The turning point. The next morning, Jonathan arrived at the diner early to find Sandy already there, sweeping the front steps. "You're here early," Jonathan said, surprised. Sandy straightened, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Figured it wouldn't hurt to get a head start. Jonathan studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good work yesterday. The meeting wasn't easy, but we made our point." Sandy looked at him, her voice quiet. "Thank you for standing up for me." Jonathan gave her a small smile. "Keep proving them wrong, Sandy. That's the best way to show them you've changed." Sandy nodded, determination lighting her face. "I will." As the sun rose over the diner, casting a warm glow on its windows, Jonathan felt a sense of cautious hope. The battle wasn't over, but the tide was turning. One plank at a time, the bridge was being rebuilt, and for the first time in a long while, Maple Ridge felt like it was moving toward something better. The days turned cooler in Maple Ridge. The golden leaves fell lazily to the ground, collecting along the sidewalk outside Clara's diner. The little bell over the door rang more frequently now, ushering in familiar faces and new ones alike. Jonathan Bennett stood at the counter one crisp morning, watching as the diner hummed with life. Maria worked the tables with her usual cheerfulness. Marcus joked with teenagers at the counter, and Sandy, yes, Sandy, was refilling coffee mugs and clearing plates without hesitation. It was a far cry from what the diner had been only weeks ago. The place that had once felt closed off, tense and judgmental, was now what Jonathan had always envisioned: a community hub, a home for anyone who walked through the door. Sandy's redemption. Sandy worked quietly but purposefully, her movements steady as she served an elderly couple seated near the window. She set down their pancakes and coffee with care, then smiled faintly. "Let me know if you need anything else." The old woman looked up, her gaze soft. "Thank you, dear." Sandy paused, clearly startled by the warmth in the woman's voice. "You're welcome," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Moments like these had begun happening more frequently. It wasn't that people had forgotten her past, it was that they had seen her efforts to change. After the lunch rush, as Sandy wiped down a table near the counter, Henry, the quiet regular, called out to her, "Sandy." She turned, clutching the rag in her hand. "Yes?" Henry smiled faintly, lifting his coffee mug. "You're doing good work." "I mean it." Sandy blinked, surprised. "Thank you." Henry nodded. "Told you people would notice." Sandy swallowed the lump in her throat and turned back to her work, but her hands were shaking. For so long, she had been convinced that redemption was out of reach. Now, it was starting to feel real. Jonathan's milestone. At the end of the week, Jonathan gathered the staff after closing. Maria, Marcus, Sandy, and Camille all stood around the counter as he leaned back against the register. "Well," Jonathan began, smiling faintly, "we've come a long way, haven't we?" Maria grinned. "Feels like a different place." "It is a different place," Jonathan corrected gently. He looked around the room, pride shining in his eyes. "Because of all of you." Marcus nudged Sandy playfully. "Even you, Sandy." Sandy rolled her eyes, though a smile tugged at her lips. "Thanks, kid." Jonathan held up a hand. "I mean it. This diner works because we work together. It's a place where everyone belongs. That's what we promised, and that's what we're delivering." Camille stepped forward then, her smile proud as she looked at her son. "I hope you realize just how much you've done, Jonathan. You didn't just fix a business. You brought this town closer together." Jonathan met his mother's eyes, emotion flickering across his face. "I couldn't have done it without you, or without them." The group stood in a moment of quiet reflection, the weight of the journey settling over them. Finally, Maria clapped her hands together. "So, what now, boss? Another community breakfast?" Jonathan smiled. "Bigger. We're hosting a harvest dinner for the entire town." The group buzzed with excitement, and even Sandy's smile widened.